Hi, this is the Philosophical Angle program, and I am your host, Chris Angle. The Philosophical Angle is the purpose of it is to analyze the nature and essence of concepts being used in current media. This week we're going to have a special program analyzing the State of the Union address of President Obama here in 2016. And so let's start with that. I'm going to run through an outline of what was said on the State of the Union, um, giving the highlights, and then we're going to discuss it with our co-host Rick Samuelson. Rick's a venture capitalist living out on the West Coast and has graduated from Yale, and is a political analyst also. Rick, good to see you.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Okay, so let's go to some of the notes here I've made on the State of the Union address. First of all, the President Obama starts out with stating that there are certain policies that we need to concentrate on. First is fairness. Second is climate change. I don't know how I don't know where he gets that word climate change, because climate is always changing. Sometimes it's warm, sometimes it's cold. Third is safety. I suppose he's referring here to the safety of Americans in the face of threat of ISIS and other possible Islamic threats throughout the world. And fourth is to be good citizens of the world. And from that, then he goes from going back to the fairness concept. He references the economy and technological changes, and he says that the technological changes put pressure on workers because of the changes that it induces in the economy, and a lot of jobs go overseas. And so when these jobs go overseas, there is a need for education and training of the workers that have been displaced by the technological changes. And so from that, he says we need free pre-K. I don't know how that evolves from education and training of workers, but it somehow does. So he's mentioned free pre-K, uh, better teachers, um, make college more affordable, and he states that he'd like to make community college free for all students. Uh, from the then he goes on to noting that the technological uh, has to we should develop clean energy. Okay, and he also then states that we should manage, and I put quotation marks on it because that's the actual word he used, manage coal and gas. I suppose this management really is a euphemism for uh, maybe downplaying the use of coal and gas, and of course, coal is already being depressed by the regulations of the EPA. The industry is almost being shut down completely. Also, other technical offshoots that he states is that he wants to cure cancer. He notes that we've been to the moon, and this nation has made a lot of technological advances throughout the last 100 years, or really since the founding of the country, and so he says let's cure cancer. Um, who can argue? Next, he also then goes on. It kind of just changes theme here and goes from those four. Um, well, then probably relating to number three of the policies, of which is safety. He then goes into the security threats and notes that the threats that are coming to the notice of the public are really only personal threats. I have a problem with that in that all threats are personal. I really, you don't really threaten anything else besides human beings. But he tries to make a distinction between a personal threat and national threats. Of course, you know, the nation's built up of individuals. So, but nevertheless, and he says that these are coming from failed states and names the Middle East area and Asia too, particularly China. He mentions as an example, and that these threats are just individual killings by fanatics. Well, I guess, you know, it's 100 here, 100 there. I guess he's not considering them that serious, or maybe it's not a prelude to bigger things. So I worry about that statement. He then asks Congress for action to eliminate ISIL, and fully agree. That's a pretty good thing to come across and ask Congress for authority to act. Then he states that the U.S. must not act alone, must mobilize the world and its allies. And then he states what we must mobilize, the purpose for which we should mobilize, and which is to fight Ebola, certainly a worthy cause, and that one of the things that we've mobilized and done and a success is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and he states that is a success. We've gathered our allies in the Pacific Rim to construct an agreement, a free trade agreement. Also, he notes that Cuba, relations with Cuba have improved, and that's true too. From this, he then states that he kind of veers off into stating that we should eliminate money for political actions. It just suddenly came out, and there was really no segue, or at least I didn't discern one. So we should eliminate money from political elections. I don't know how you do that. I guess the party in control is always the one that would always like to eliminate money for political elections because they have the most news media following, and those that are not in control have to raise money and get it through private means, in other words, purchase their words in the media. So taking money out is a pretty difficult thing, considering the First Amendment. World respect is also primary importance in this portion of the speech, and we must compromise is the other thing that he said. Not that I've been thinking that the GOP has been compromising too much, and that's probably why the rise of Trump and the conservative wing of the GOP. So that's a quick summary, and so let's go to Rick and see what he's got to say and his response to the State of the Union, and then if we have time, we'll go into the GOP response put out by Nikki Haley of South Carolina. So Rick, any opening comments on the State of the Union address? Go ahead.
Well, it's all pretty small bore stuff by way of naming achievements and defining a strategy and so forth. I think there's almost a religious following on the left with respect to climate change, and that this is the crucial issue of our time. No mention of the fact that the national debt is approaching $20 trillion and has almost doubled since Mr. Obama took office. These are unprecedented numbers, actually, and there was no mention of the implications of that and how we deal with that going forward, or how our children deal with that in terms of paying it down to a more manageable level. In terms of employment, the labor participation rate, which is the real unemployment rate, is still at 40-year lows. No mention as to how that should be addressed, if at all. No mention of how business growth, business development, startups, whatever, can be fostered. There are now more companies failing than being started in the United States year after year.
Mm-hmm.
So you could consider that to be a very severe national problem if indeed you're going to have private sector growth, which is where all wealth springs from. And even most leftist economists would more or less agree with that. Not all of them, but more or less. So I think the major issues of our time were kind of conveniently ignored in favor of a kind of spotty checklist of activities, whether it's relations with Cuba, which are meaningless actually in the greater scheme of things, that he thinks will somehow burnish his legacy.
One thing that he didn't mention also that is prevalent amongst the GOP platforms is our taxes. All the GOP platforms of the presidential contenders is that they've all want to reduce taxes.
Yeah. I guess tax reform has been around so long, and I don't think the Republicans have taken a strong enough lead in pushing that issue. They could have been much more forceful on that, because that was probably the one area where there could have been compromise early on in this administration. But they chose to focus on other things. So obviously, Obama wants to grow the state, and will always be wary of tax reductions. But in terms of eliminating certain loopholes, I think progress could have been made there. I think simplification is something both parties could have agreed on. So it's a shame to see that literally no progress has been made, and if anything, taxes have gone up, broadly speaking. The other issue, in the context of college affordability, that should have been mentioned is the fact that we are on the verge of a student loan crisis. If you look at the default rates, the real default rates, I'm just simply defining it as loans not being paid back as we speak for whatever reason, whether it's because you're going to a different school or you have some sort of period of grace period. It's approaching a third. So this is fast becoming the next financial crisis, and the numbers are obviously gigantic. Student loans now exceed 1.2 trillion. These are very, very large numbers, and the next presidential administration will have to deal with the fallout. So a battle that's coming for whoever is the next president will be to what degree the state bails out student loans, just as they bailed out the banks and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in the wake of the mortgage crisis.
Yeah, what about an idea of like free college for at public schools for well, I think he said free for the community colleges. So, what about that idea? Is that good for America? Just give free. I mean, actually, they're usually pretty cheap anyway, but just make it free for all kids entering.
My philosophy on that is that anything that's free quickly gets abused and taken for granted and not used efficiently. I think there is a way through the educational cost problem, but it's going to be an online solution whereby uh, local governments or states, hopefully not the federal government, but smaller bodies set up uh, essentially certificate programs whereby you take courses online. There's a uh, uniform test at the end, whether it's in computer science or um, certain areas of engineering or what have you. And for a relatively nominal fee, you take the courses online, you take the test, and you crush the cost of education to a fraction of its current level at brick and mortar facilities. And the
Okay.
brick and mortar facilities would be restricted to um, a much smaller element of education. Students would meet much less frequently, and therefore you wouldn't need as many instructors, and you could pay them less,
Okay.
and you wouldn't need many administrators.
Okay. Good thought. Let's move on to security threats. Part of the speech. He mentioned that the failing states in the Middle East and Asia, particularly China. I don't know why he calls China a failing state, but anyway, in the Middle East is um, there was a direct reference there. He talks about individual threats as opposed to national threats. Should he divide such a threat into two? I made some comment about that. What do you think?
Okay, well, China spends a couple hundred billion on defense at the moment, to our 600 plus on defense, so they're about a third of our level. 10 years from now, they'll be whatever, two-thirds our level, or maybe even at parity. So to speak of them as other than a large-scale um, player in a military context is plainly ridiculous. They're going to have big aircraft carriers. They're going to have the most advanced fighters. They're going to have the most advanced missiles that money can buy, or they will invent them and build them. As for um, regional players, primarily in the Middle East, uh, it's it's pretty obvious that ISIS keeps metastasizing. Wasn't it announced in the Journal yesterday that the United States, on account of ISIS penetration into Afghanistan, is suddenly allowing troops there to respond to ISIS attacks in addition to those of the Taliban? I mean, to me, that smacks of an expanding, um, ever changing threat that is constantly looking for weaknesses um, on the part of the United States and other uh, functioning states. So it's not just the United States they're attacking, obviously, but it's other more local governments. And so I don't see that they've been contained in any way. Um, they may have had their field of operations shrunken a bit in parts of Syria and Iraq because of U.S. and other allied attacks, but they seem to be expanding elsewhere. So it's a metastasizing, very difficult, very facile, agile enemy
Hmm.
that's going to continue to cause deaths on a more or less weekly basis.
Yeah. Do you think that the ISIS, the state of ISIS, is going to uh, well, you used the word metastasize, and so be a prelude to greater things or larger things. I shouldn't really see greater things, but larger devastation in the future, coming from isolated attacks to coordinated attacks on a regular basis. Is this something the United States should be concerned about?
Well, I think so because it's kind of the law of unintended consequences, right? When they attack Yemen or Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan or parts of Africa,
or the West in its coordinated attacks in Paris, Brussels, and elsewhere.
Well, there's that too, but inevitably the victims of these attacks respond in some way, and that can have unforeseen implications. So ISIS is now in the mix in an ongoing dispute between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And so, because that complicates the whole dynamic, you're never quite sure when someone is going to make a mistake, and that will lead to poor decisions and attacks that shouldn't have been made, or responses that shouldn't have been made, or excessive responses. It's just creating an environment in which the degree of militarization across an increasing number of countries is growing.
Okay, I'd like to go on to one more question that was raised by the State of the Union that's particularly interesting. He mentioned Cuba relations are becoming better, and he's opening up Cuba. Hey, what do you think? Should Cuba itself, the embargo be lifted and the United States comes to full relationships with Cuba? Is that a positive or a negative?
I think it's irrelevant to the United States. It would be wonderful for Cuba. I think the fact that there's something like 50,000, I don't know if they know the exact number, but there's a very large number of Cubans who right now are trying to get into the United States on the back of this diplomatic activity is shameful. I mean, this is not how equal partners behave toward each other in a fair agreement, in my view.
Why is it shameful?
Well, if we're recognizing Cuba as an equal partner and therefore affording them the respect you would afford a normal country that's treating its citizens well, then why would they be leaving in droves?
Okay, I understand now. Okay. Okay, great. I want to thanks Rick for joining us, and thank you for viewing this episode of the Philosophical Angle. And we'll see you next week. Have a good day.
Thank you.